Well, the vast bulk of Putin's address was focused on domestic issues, on improving the standard of living of ordinary Russians, helping Russia's regions, its poor families, on overcoming the coronavirus pandemic. He really devoted very little of his speech to foreign policy issues. Although on that topic, his rhetoric was rather harsh and it drew a lot of media attention. He clearly believes that relations with the West have reached a qualitatively new stage, one in which terms like friendship and partnership, even difficult partnership or strained relations, simply no longer apply. He did not specifically mention the United States, but it was quite clear who he was referring to in the foreign policy portions of his speech. He was sending a message to Washington, and I think that message was rather simple. Russia does not want a conflict. It does not seek a conflict, but Putin was clear it will defend its interests resolutely if it is challenged. Putin clearly warned the West against crossing Russia's red lines, but he was not specific about where those red lines are drawn. And I think this ambiguity was quite intentional. It allows him some degree of flexibility in deciding where to draw lines and when and where to react under developing circumstances. And it also creates some uncertainty in the West about where those lines are actually drawn. And Putin probably hopes that this uncertainty will produce some caution in Washington and Brussels about confronting Russia, about not approaching possible red lines recklessly. But even though Putin's language was non-specific, I think when you look at the full extent of what he had to say on foreign policy, it's pretty clear about the kinds of things that he's concerned about, where he perceives some red lines. He began that portion of his address by talking about a supposed coup plot that took place in Belarus, which was allegedly sponsored by the West, although he didn't explicitly make that accusation. But it was very clear that this kind of thing in his mind should not be permitted. And then he linked that supposed plot in Belarus to what happened in Ukraine in 2014, which Moscow clearly saw at that time as a US-sponsored coup d'etat. So it's quite clear that he is saying to us, attempts at regime change in Russia's neighbors or even in Russia itself are out of bounds. They cross a red line in Putin's view. And I think it's also very safe to say that NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia would clearly cross a Russian red line. I think that Putin's warning was meant to be a deterrent for the United States and NATO. He doesn't want to provoke a conflict. I think his overwhelming focus in the speech on domestic affairs, on improving life at home for Russians, reflects this priority. At the same time, I think we're seeing a similar phenomenon going on in the West toward Russia, in that the United States and NATO are convinced that Russia is a threat to attack Ukraine, to engage in acts of aggression of various kinds. And they hope that their own warnings and actions to counter this Russian threat will have a deterrent effect on Moscow. So I think what we're seeing is a dynamic in which each side is trying to show strength in order to deter what it sees as aggression on the other side. The danger here is not that either side wants a conflict. The danger is that rationality doesn't always prevail in these kinds of situations, particularly when there are a host of factors at work interacting with each other in complex ways. So the great powers don't want a confrontation, I think, but third parties might see their interests served by taking some actions that could trigger a chain reaction of events that spiral out of control. That's, I think, to a large degree what happened in Georgia in 2008. Things that the United States then thought would deter Russia ended up provoking it. Things that we thought would keep the Georgian leadership under control wound up inadvertently encouraging it to run reckless risks that it probably wouldn't have run otherwise. So I think the situation in Eastern Europe is a delicate one that requires very careful diplomacy. We're not necessarily on a collision course, but a host of factors could line up in such a way that we could wind up in a conflict that neither Russia nor the West wants.